So I'm going to start out with an old story that I came across. It's by Christian Andersen called The Emperor's New Clothes. Now, many of you are probably familiar with this story, but for those of you who are not, let me tell the story here. The emperor loved clothes, and he hired some men to make him some new clothes. And these were men that pretended to be weavers, but in reality, they were con men. And so the weavers promised to make very special clothes. These clothes would be beautiful, amazing to all those who were wise and pure in heart. But to the unwise and to the impure, these clothes would be invisible. Meaning, if you think this through here, if you did not see the clothes, you are stupid, is what it's implying here. And so the emperor paid a lot of money for these clothes, and he wanted to, when they were finished, to go show them off to his kingdom. And so the con men would sit around at the looms all day and pretend to make clothes that were actually invisible. And the emperor, after a while, got impatient, so he sent his chief minister to check on things. And this minister went to the looms, to where the con men were, and he looked at them, and he didn't see anything. But he didn't want to come across as unwise or impure. So he went back to the king with a glowing report of how beautiful these clothes were. Well, a little while passed, and the con men said, hey, we need a little bit more money to complete this project. And so the emperor sent another chief minister, his second in command. And this minister looked, and he didn't see the clothes, but he didn't want to come across as unwise, as impure, as stupid. And so he came back with an even more glowing report compared to the first minister. So finally, the emperor could not wait any longer. And so he went himself to look at the clothes. And when he looked at them, he looked at those looms and he could not see anything. But he didn't want to come across as unwise or impure. And so he declared the clothes the most beautiful and excellent thing that he's ever seen. And he awarded these con men, these weavers, some medals. And then the day came where he was going to go and show the people at this parade. And the weavers, the con men, dressed them in these invisible clothes here. And then they skipped town. They got out of there quick. And so the king went out in front of the people, and he started showing off his new clothes. And when in reality, he was naked there walking around. And everyone in the kingdom did not want to come across as stupid or as unwise. And so they started cheering him on, thinking, wow, those are amazing clothes there. Until one moment in the parade, there was this kid, this quiet moment. The kid said, hey, the emperor has no clothes. And that little saying there, him saying that, made the entire kingdom realize the foolishness of what they were doing. Well, hold on to that story for just a moment. And as I said, we're in a series through the book of Romans. And in chapters 1 through 3, we've heard a lot about the bad news and the good news. The bad news is that every one of us is sinful. We are all full of sin. And because of that sinfulness, we are separated from God, and we cannot make a way for us to be with God on our own. Now, we can't act good enough. We can't act religious enough. We can't be right enough in God's eyes. And because of that, we are destined for a life without God. That's the bad news. And that's pretty bad news, isn't it? But here's the good news that Paul's also been talking about. The good news is that Jesus stepped in. He came to this earth on what we celebrate as Christmas. He died for us, and then died for us on the cross, and then rose again on what we celebrate as Easter. And in doing so, he made a way for us to be made right because he became the ultimate sacrifice. He died for our sins. He took our punishment upon himself. And so now anyone who puts their faith in him can be saved, no matter how sinful we are. And so as Paul would preach this good news and this bad news all around the Roman Empire, he likely heard objections from time to time as he would tell people this. And so in writing to the Roman people, in the book of Romans here, he then sort of preemptively, proactively would give some answers to the objections that he often heard. And so what he's doing here is he's in essence being like that little child correcting the king and the people's wrong thinking. He's saying, hey, the way that you're acting, that righteousness that you think you're clothing yourselves with, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And so he's speaking the truth there, exposing false beliefs. And so now we're going to look at this wrong thinking as we work our way through verses 1 through 8. And we're going to see that Paul's talking about it from a Jewish perspective, because he's writing to a lot of the folks who were Jews. But we'll also see that a lot of what he's talking about here, in fact, all of what he's talking about here, has application that we can take for ourselves as well. So I'm going to give you, as we work our way through verses 1 through 8, 4 wrong thinkings, 4 ways that people think wrong about the good news and the bad news. 4 objections. And so here's wrong thinking number 1. Wrong thinking number 1 is that I am sinful no matter what, or if I am sinful no matter what, then I might as well avoid all religious actions. Let me read verse 1. Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. Now, Paul brings up what I might call 2 actions that were very prominent back then. First of all, he says the value of being a Jew. Now, as a devout Jew, you followed these Old Testament rules religiously, devoutly, you followed them. But then he also mentions circumcision, which is an outward act to show that they were Jewish people. And Paul, in chapter 1 and 2, made it very clear that religious actions do not save you. And so you can do these religious things, but those are not what make you right before God. And so what likely happened was that when he would say this, your devoutness does not save you. Your circumcision doesn't save you. They would likely say, well, then I'm not going to do anything at all. That's what probably some people told him. And Paul would say, hey, no, that's not the case. There is value to it. Now, none of us are going to be too concerned about circumcision or being a Jew, because most of us are not in that category, at least in the terms of religious thinking. But there are plenty of things that we do today that we could add into these religious actions that we think may make us right before God. In the past few weeks, I've talked about how going to church does not make you saved. Reading the Bible does not in and of itself save you. Doing religious things, whatever you may think is religious, does not save you. These things do not save you. And so the thinking is, if they don't save me, I'll just not do any of them. And the answer is, Paul would say, no, there is value in these things, even if they don't save you. So Paul says to the Jews that they have been entrusted with the oracles of God, meaning that their religious actions that they were doing as they were being a devout Jew, these religious actions helped them learn a lot about God. And so even though Bible knowledge doesn't save you, even though Old Testament knowledge doesn't save you, there's still a huge benefit in it. A couple of weeks ago, my kids and I were in the backyard of our house, and we had to burn some cardboard. Now, it had just rained the day before, so everything was wet. And I say that because when I post a little video about what we did, there's a few unhappy people thinking that I was like going to burn down New Hampshire. No, everything was wet, so chill, people, chill. But anyways, we had this wet cardboard that we had let out, and we took it into our little backyard there, and I knew that it wasn't going to light very easily, so I dumped some gasoline onto it. But as I explained probably about 6 months ago, it's a bad idea to be near a fire that you start that has gasoline dumped on it. Lesson learned, right? 6 months ago, you walked away from church knowing not to do that. So what I did was I made a little fuse. And so I did this paper trail with gasoline, and we got far, far away from the fire, got probably like 5 or 10 feet from it, and then we lit it. And so let me go ahead and show just this 10 or 15 second video of what we did here and how it worked out.
Whoa!
So this fire started quickly because I had what I might call, I had pre-fueled it. If I had not put anything on it, it would have eventually lit and it would eventually burned, but it would have taken a lot longer. And so would have lit, yes, but it would have taken a long time. And so putting this gasoline, this fuel on it, gave it that big boost, that we thought was pretty cool when it exploded, when we were away from it, that we thought was cool. Now, why am I laboring this point here? Because just because religious actions don't save you doesn't mean you shouldn't throw them out completely. In fact, some of the religious actions that you do will greatly benefit your spiritual life. Parents, raising your kids to know the Bible is a really good thing. Having them go to church every week with you is a good thing. And even if doing those things right at that moment does not save them, what you're doing then is you are essentially pouring gasoline onto their life so that when God does ignite their heart, it will go far more than when they become a Christian and don't know anything about the Bible. Takes them a lot longer to learn. So I want to encourage you. Taking your kids to church, as some of you can attest, will not make them saved. But taking your kids to church will prepare them for when God works in their heart. Teaching them the Bible will prepare them when you teach them at home. Will prepare them so that one day when God works in their heart, they will go and burn brightly for God. Now, Christians, you may be saved. Maybe you're already saved, and you're not growing. And maybe what you need is what I call like a spiritual accelerant. Your spiritual growth can increase by adding some fuel to it. And so some of the ways that we do that is getting into Scripture, going to church, spending time fasting and praying and worshiping, all of these things, which, by the way, do not save you, do not make you saved, but all of these things can help you grow spiritually. And so get into church and do these things. And if they are used correctly, they can be an accelerant in your life. So that's wrong thinking, number one. Let's go on now to wrong thinking, number two. Sinful Christians show that God can't save me. Verse 3. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. So someone at some point must have said to Paul, if God is so faithful, if God is such a good God, then why is brother so-and-so so unfaithful? If God is so good, then why are his followers so bad? Their badness, they assume, must mean that God is not very good at saving people. And we've all thought something like this along these lines at some point. We look at churches or we look at people that claim to be Christians and we think, maybe at one point we thought in the past, if that's a Christian, then I don't want anything to do with God. And so just because, though, a group of people or a person or even a large denomination is sinful does not negate who God is. In fact, we'll see in future weeks as we continue through Romans that our sinfulness shows even more clearly God's faithfulness. And so thinking about this through modern eyes, it's easy for us to look at any church, our church and any other church, and see hypocritical people. And the false assumption is that since these people are hypocritical, God may not be real, or God is not powerful enough to save people, or God is just, not good. And Paul flat out says that people's unfaithfulness does not negate the faithfulness of God. How many of you have ever driven past a car accident and you look at it and this car's all messed up and you see, oh, that car maker must be an awful car maker? Anyone? No, we don't drive past accidents thinking, seeing this car and thinking that it's Toyota's fault or it's Kia's fault. We look at the car and we say, oh, well, someone must have not been driving right. Someone on one of the sides must not have done something correctly. I mean, it must be a poor driver there somewhere, not the car company. And just because Christians sin does not make the maker of people unfaithful or not good enough. Listen, every week we can look at the news and see or read about people, Christians, churchgoers, pastors who mess up, who do some sort of immorality and end up on the news in some way. But does that immorality mean that God isn't real or he can't save? And the answer is a big fat no. It just means that some Christians can't drive their lives very well. Now, I have no plans to end up on the news, but listen, there will come a day, if you stick around long enough, where I will disappoint you. And some of you are like, Kyle, that day has passed for quite a while now. It's multiple times. Now maybe, and I pray it won't be some big public sin, but as my wife and kids will attest, I am a sinful human. And so I may lose my temper with you in a meeting. I may unknowingly honk at you as you drive too slow through Hampstead and I'm driving to work. You may see me be cranky at my kids at Market Basket. I could go on and on and on. We could spend a whole day me telling you about the ways in which I could fail you. But no matter what I do, even as a pastor, that does not cancel out what God has done. Because God is faithful no matter what. So if you came with someone today, I want you to just take a little quick peek at them. You don't have to say anything to them. We're not one of those churches that say, go tell your neighbor this. But just take a little peek at them. And listen, that person you just saw will likely one day mess up. That person you saw may hurt you in a big way, may sin in a big way. But no matter how hypocritical that person is that came into church with you, that does not cancel out the faithfulness of God. So that's wrong thinking number 2. Let's go now on to wrong thinking number 3. And it is unloving of God to punish me for my actions. Verse 5. If our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means. For then, how would God judge the world? So I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, and rightly so, how many times I've been asked, how can a loving God send, quote unquote, good people to hell? Or another way, as Paul puts it, why would a good God punish people? After all, he's good, he's loving. We often see that online. People say, well, why would a loving God not let me live the way I want to? Why would a loving God judge me? He's loving. He wants me to do what I want. But Paul responds by saying that a good judge, that God is judge, actually judging his people shows that he is righteous. This summer, a lot of people got angry at Judge Travis Kitchens in Polk County, Texas. He was the judge of a case that he presided over it, involving a 19-year-old male who assaulted a 14-year-old female. And the male was found guilty, and the prosecutors recommended 15 years in prison for them. But the judge ended up sentencing him in a way where he only ended up with another 100 days in prison, and then he was released on probation. And so when people found out about this, that this guy only got basically, from their perspective, 100 days in prison for what he did to this 14-year-old, they were very angry. Now let me ask you, was it loving of Judge Kitchens to sentence a rapist to a short prison time? Was that loving of him to do? Did it show that Judge Kitchens here is a good, loving judge? Now, with that in mind, why would we think that it's unloving of God to sentence guilty people to a just punishment? If God were to just stop and say, "Oh, never mind, just kidding. Everyone gets to go to heaven. All you guilty folks, the doors are open." Would that make him a good judge? And I encourage you, instead of getting mad about God's judgment of guilty people, let's just let the reality of his judgment sink in and being more intentional about sharing the good news with guilty people, which, by the way, all of us once were as well. Because maybe, just maybe, we would have a point if we were complaining that God was judging us and not making a way for us to be out of that judgment, to be declared not guilty. But that's not the case, because God is judging all people. And rightly so. But he is also providing a way for us to be declared not guilty through Jesus Christ. So he is judging us, but he has also provided a way for us to be saved. And so let's not focus on fairness. Let's focus on telling others about the good news in the midst of our guiltiness. So that's wrong thinking number 3. Let's look at the last wrong thinking. This is number 4 here. Since my sin shows God's righteousness, I will just sin more to show more of God's righteousness. Verse 7. But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned a sinner? And why not do evil that good may come? As some people slanderously charge us with saying, their condemnation is just. So I think, in my opinion, this is a valid question that some people were raising to Paul. If God has made a way for people to be forgiven of their sins, and if God is forgiving people, and if that shows his love and mercy, then why not just give God an opportunity to show more of his love and mercy? But Paul would say, no, no, no. I heard one pastor tell a story about a son that grew up without a father. He grew up with a single mom. And he found out that his single mom had an affair with this guy who was married to another person, but she didn't know that he was married. And so she eventually got pregnant, and then the boyfriend didn't want anything to do with her, and so he left her, and then she went to raise the son on her own. So the son grows up in a single family household and eventually becomes a Christian, and then after that, later on, becomes a pastor. And so now as an adult, the pastor wants to go and find his biological dad and meet him. And so he searches for him, he finds him, and he arranges a meeting with him. And when he meets with him, he tells him his story that he eventually became a Christian, and then he's now a pastor. I can imagine him telling it, like how he's proud of the direction that he's headed in his life. And the dad tells him this: "Well, it's a good thing I had an affair with your mother." Now let's think about that. Is it a good thing? Is it a good thing that someone cheats on their family, to have an affair with someone and then leaves them, just so that years later this person may end up as a Christian and a pastor? Now, that's not a good thing. The good thing is that God turned a bad situation into a good one. But there's nothing good in and of itself about pursuing sin. And likewise, God can and does take bad and sinful situations and turn them into good situations. But that does not mean that we should just think that we can go and sin more in order to bring out more good situations from God. And so I want to just stop now and think, well, what does this last point mean for us? I want to encourage us to think this through here. Don't mistake God's grace as a license to sin. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Christian pastor and theologian, and he was alive during the time of the war, World War II, and was eventually sentenced to a concentration camp by Hitler and killed there. But before he died, he wrote a little book called The Cost of Discipleship. And I want to read you just parts of one page from that book. And this is where he talks about something called cheap grace. He writes, "Cheap grace means grace sold on the market like Cheap Jack's wares. Grace without price. Grace without cost. The essence of grace, we suppose, is that the account has been paid in advance. And because it has been paid, everything can be had for nothing. Since the cost was infinite, the possibilities of using and spending it are infinite. What would grace be if it were not cheap? Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession, absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. Costly grace, on the other hand, is the treasure hidden in the field. For the sake of it, a man will go and sell all that he has. It is the pearl of great price to buy, which the merchant will sell all his goods. It is the kingly rule of Christ, for whose sake a man will pluck out his eye, which causes him to stumble. It is the call of Jesus Christ at which the disciple leaves his net and follows him. Costly grace is the gospel which must be sought again and again, the gift which must be asked for, the door at which a man must knock. One more paragraph here. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow, and it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life. And it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it cost God the life of his Son. Ye were bought at a price. And what has cost God much cannot be cheap for us. Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to pay for our life, but delivered him up for us. Costly grace is the incarnation of God. So that's what I want to close with. The good news is really good news for all of us. And he's made a way for us, sinners, to be made right with God. But in one sense, this is very easy for us to attain. We simply put our faith in Jesus, and the Bible says that we are saved. But don't mistake your ease in attaining salvation as meaning it did not cost a lot to provide. So Jesus Christ paid for your salvation dearly. He paid for it with his own life. Through literal blood, sweat, and tears, he hung on the cross for each of us. And so I challenge you today, don't leave here thinking that forgiveness is a license to just go and do whatever you want. That's cheap grace. God's calling us to more than that. He's not just calling us to forgiveness, though he's giving us that. He's calling us to be part of his family. So I challenge you today, let's accept the good news, but let's also live out the good news. Because anything short of that is just cheap grace. Let's go ahead and spend a moment now in prayer.